I think for her it was this place where she could be like wild and free.
February 14th, 2024. While the world was buying flowers and chocolate, a legal document was quietly filed in a Shelby County courthouse that would rewrite the final chapter of the Presley family legacy. The language was cold, clinical, buried in subsection 12 of a 73-page estate amendment. But the message was unmistakable. Priscilla Presley, the woman who'd spent nearly 5 decades positioning herself as the keeper of Elvis's flame, would never be buried at Graceland. Not beside Elvis, not near Lisa Marie. Not even in the same soil as the family she'd spent half a century claiming as her own. Riley Keough's legal team made sure of that, and the clause they inserted into the Meditation Garden's burial deed wasn't symbolic. It wasn't a negotiation point or a bargaining chip in some larger settlement. It was absolute. When Priscilla Presley dies, she will not rest in the place she spent 50 years treating like her personal museum and cash register. She'll be buried somewhere else, alone, with full knowledge that the last true Presley blocked her from entering the only ground that ever mattered. Most people who heard about this thought it was just another ugly chapter in the Graceland estate battle. Riley versus Priscilla. The inevitable collision of a granddaughter trying to protect her inheritance and a grandmother desperate to maintain control. The tabloids framed it as greed, as a younger generation being cruel to an aging matriarch who just wanted to be close to the man she once loved. But that narrative is a lie, and anyone who actually understands what happened in the years after Elvis died, what Lisa Marie discovered in the final months of her life, knows this has nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with justice. Because Riley didn't just wake up one day and decide to punish her grandmother. This wasn't a power move or an emotional outburst. This was the execution of her mother's final wish. A wish rooted in a betrayal so complete, so calculated, that it took Lisa Marie 45 years to fully piece together. And when she did, when she finally understood what her mother had done in the days and years after her father's death, it broke something inside her that never healed. You have to understand what's actually at stake here. Graceland's meditation garden isn't just a cemetery. It's the most sacred ground in rock and roll history. Elvis lies there between his mother Gladys and his father Vernon, the two people who gave him life and shaped everything he became. Lisa Marie rests beside him now, reunited with her father after decades of longing. And her son Benjamin, who took his own life in 2020, lies there too, finally at peace in the place where his family's story began and ended. It's a circle of blood, of gnaw, of people who loved Elvis Presley the person, not Elvis Presley the brand. Priscilla was never part of that circle. She was married to Elvis for 6 years, 6 years out of his 42 on Earth. She left him in 1972, walked away while he was still alive, still breathing, still capable of being saved. And the moment he died, she walked back in. Not as a grieving ex-wife, not as a heartbroken mother trying to shield her daughter from tragedy. She walked back in as a businesswoman who understood exactly what Elvis's death meant for her bank account. The public doesn't know this because Priscilla has spent 5 decades controlling the narrative. She became the spokesperson, the protector, the woman who saved Graceland when it was going bankrupt. She sat for interviews with that carefully practiced sadness in her eyes, talking about the man she loved, the father of her child, the king who never stopped being part of her soul. She wrote books, she consulted on movies, she approved merchandise and licensing deals and touring exhibitions. She became Elvis Presley's widow in everything but legal fact, and the world let her do it, because grief is powerful, and who wants to question a woman mourning the father of her daughter? But Lisa Marie knew the truth, and in the last year of her life, she found the proof. There's a document. Multiple documents, actually, hidden for decades in places Lisa Marie never thought to look, until she started doing her own estate planning and realized how many secrets her mother had kept locked away. Financial records that didn't make sense. Legal agreements signed in the days immediately after Elvis died, when everyone should have been too devastated to think about money. Contracts between Priscilla and Colonel Tom Parker that predated Elvis's death by months. Agreements that only made sense if both parties knew the golden goose was about to stop laying eggs and wanted to secure their piece of the carcass. Lisa Marie found letters too. Correspondence between her mother and attorneys, between Priscilla and business managers, discussions about maximizing the estate's value and controlling the narrative and managing Lisa Marie's expectations. She found evidence of decisions made on her behalf when she was 9 years old and grieving. Decisions that locked her out of her own inheritance until she was 25. Decisions that gave Priscilla control over every dollar that came out of Graceland while Lisa Marie watched from the sidelines. And she found something else. Something that made her call Jerry Schilling at 3 a.m, sobbing so hard he could barely understand her. A will. Not the will that was executed after Elvis died. A different will. One that Elvis had drafted in the spring of 1977, just months before his death. A will that told a very different story about who Elvis wanted controlling his legacy and who he wanted kept as far away from it as possible. Riley has that document now. She has all of it. Every contract, every letter, every piece of evidence that Lisa Marie compiled in those final months when she realized the scope of what had been done to her father's memory and her own life. And she's using it exactly the way her mother intended. Not for money, not for control, but to make sure that when the final chapter of this story is written, when the last burial plot at Graceland is filled, Priscilla Presley's name isn't on it. What could be so unforgivable that a granddaughter would break tradition, defy public opinion, and ensure her grandmother dies knowing she'll be buried alone? The answer is in August 1977, in the 40, 8 hours after Elvis took his last breath. And it's worse than you think. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. August 16th, 1977, 2:30 in the afternoon. Elvis Presley was pronounced dead in the emergency room at Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis. The official cause would later be listed as cardiac arrhythmia, a sanitized way of saying his heart simply stopped. But in those first moments after the doctor called it, while the world was still spinning in ignorance and the news hadn't broken yet, something else was already in motion. Something that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with opportunity. Priscilla wasn't at Graceland when Elvis died. She was in Los Angeles, living the life she'd chosen when she walked away 5 years earlier. She'd moved on, built a new world for herself. And when the call came that afternoon, her reaction wasn't the collapse of a heartbroken ex-wife. According to people who were in the room with her, people who've stayed silent for decades out of loyalty or fear or both, Priscilla's first question wasn't about how he died or whether he suffered. It was about whether the will had been updated recently. That's what witnesses remember. Not tears, not shock. A question about paperwork. She didn't rush back to Memphis. The chartered flights were available. Money wasn't an issue. But Priscilla took a commercial flight the next morning, arriving at Graceland nearly 24 hours after Elvis had been declared dead. By the time she walked through those famous gates, her ex-husband's body was already back at the mansion, lying in state in the foyer while thousands of fans gathered outside, weeping for a man they'd never met. And while 9-year-old Lisa Marie sat upstairs in her bedroom, catatonic with grief, trying to process that her father was never coming back, Priscilla was downstairs taking meetings. Joe Esposito was there, Elvis's road manager, his friend, one of the Memphis Mafia members who'd been with the king since the early days. Joe was a loyal soldier, the kind of man who'd take secrets to his grave. And he did take most of them. But in private conversations years later, conversations that were never meant to be recorded or repeated, Joe admitted what he witnessed in those first 48 hours. He watched Priscilla arrive at Graceland and immediately sequester herself with estate attorneys. Not family attorneys helping with funeral arrangements. Estate attorneys. The kind who specialize in asset protection and wealth transfer and making sure the right people get the right pieces of the pie. Within 24 hours of Elvis's death, before the autopsy was even complete, Priscilla sat down with Colonel Tom Parker. This meeting happened. It's documented in visitor logs that were sealed as part of the estate's private records, but people who worked at Graceland remember it because of how unusual it was. The colonel wasn't welcome at the mansion during Elvis's final years. Their relationship had soured, twisted into something that looked more like hostage and captor than manager and client. Elvis had started talking about firing him, about breaking free. And yet there was Parker, less than a day after Elvis died, sitting in the dining room with Priscilla like they were old friends plotting a business venture. What they discussed in that meeting wouldn't come to light for years, but the results showed up fast. Priscilla began pushing for an immediate inventory of Elvis's assets. Not next week. Not after the funeral. Immediately, she wanted to know what was in the bank accounts, what property existed, what contracts were still active, what royalties were due. And she wanted her own people counting it, her own attorneys verifying it, because she didn't trust Vernon, Elvis's father, who'd been named executor of the will. There was a moment, captured in the memory of a Graceland staff member who's never given their name publicly, that tells you everything you need to know about those 48 hours. This person was walking past Elvis's private office on the second floor, the room where he'd handled his personal business, kept his private files, the space that was supposed to be locked down and secured as part of the estate. The door was open, and inside was Priscilla, alone, going through desk drawers and file cabinets, removing documents and placing them in a leather bag she'd brought with her. When this staff member asked what she was doing, Priscilla's response was cold and immediate. She said she was securing items that belonged to her, things that were private between her and Elvis, and that it was none of their concern. The staff member didn't push back. Who would? This was Elvis Presley's ex-wife, the mother of his only child. What were they supposed to do? Physically stop her? Call the police on a grieving family member? So they walked away, and Priscilla kept removing documents from that office while upstairs, just down the hall, Lisa Marie sobbed herself into exhaustion. But it was what Priscilla did with the will that revealed the true scope of her calculation. Elvis's will was straightforward on the surface. It left everything to his father Vernon as executor, with Lisa Marie as the sole beneficiary once she reached adulthood. Priscilla wasn't mentioned as a beneficiary at all. They were divorced. She'd walked away with her settlement. She had no legal claim to Elvis's estate. But she found a way in anyway, and she did it by manipulating the one thing no one would question, her role as Lisa Marie's mother. Priscilla pushed hard for changes to how the will would be executed. Not changes to the will itself, that couldn't be done, but changes to the trust structure, to the management of Lisa Marie's inheritance. She argued that Lisa Marie was too young, too fragile, too damaged by her father's death to handle any financial responsibility. She convinced Vernon, who was grieving his son and desperate to protect his granddaughter, that Lisa Marie needed to be shielded from the money until she was mature enough to handle it. Not at 18, like Elvis had wanted. At 25. That 7-year difference gave Priscilla everything she needed. As Lisa Marie's mother and guardian, she'd have input on every major financial decision. She'd have influence over the estate's management. she'd have access to the Graceland operation, to the merchandising deals, to every revenue stream that Elvis's death was about to create. And she made sure those arrangements were locked in place before Elvis was even in the ground. The funeral was August 18th, 72 hours after Elvis died. And by the time they lowered his body into the meditation garden, Priscilla had already negotiated a percentage deal with Colonel Parker on posthumous earnings. She'd already secured her position as a consultant on the estate. She'd already made herself indispensable to the financial machine that Elvis's death had activated. Lisa Marie wouldn't find out about any of this until she was in her 30s, old enough to start asking questions about why her mother controlled so much of a legacy that wasn't legally hers. But the document Lisa Marie found in 2022 wasn't just about money or control or Priscilla's calculated maneuvering in those 48 hours. It was about something deeper, something that cut to the core of who Elvis wanted protecting his memory after he was gone. And Priscilla's name wasn't on it. In fact, Elvis had tried to remove her entirely. He'd seen her coming. He just died before he could lock the door. Spring 1977. Memphis was warming up, Graceland's lawn turning green again, and Elvis Presley was planning his escape. Not from the mansion or the fame or even the pills that were slowly killing him. He was planning his escape from the legal cage he'd been living in for 20 years. The contracts, the handlers, the people who'd turned his name into a corporation and his life into a product. And at the center of that plan was a document that would change everything about who controlled his legacy after he was gone. Elvis met with a new attorney that spring. Not his longtime lawyer, not the man who'd handled his affairs for decades and had ties to Colonel Parker's operation. This was someone different. Someone recommended by a friend outside the music industry. Someone who had no connection to the machinery that had been grinding Elvis down since he was 21 years old. The meeting happened quietly, away from Graceland, in an office in downtown Memphis, where Elvis could slip in through a back entrance without anyone knowing he was there. What Elvis told this attorney was simple but devastating. He wanted a new will. He wanted to strip control away from everyone who'd been feeding off him for years and put his affairs in the hands of people he actually trusted. People who loved him as a human being, not as a revenue stream. The will he drafted that spring was a complete rewrite of his legacy plan, and if it had been signed and filed, everything that happened after his death would have unfolded differently. Vernon was still named as executor. That part stayed the same. Elvis loved his father despite Vernon's weaknesses, despite the gambling and the poor decisions and the way he'd let Colonel Parker steamroll him for years. But Elvis added something crucial. He named Linda Thompson, his girlfriend at the time, as co-trustee with Lisa Marie once she turned 21. Not 25, 21. Elvis wanted his daughter to have control of her inheritance the moment she was legally an adult, and he wanted Linda there to guide her through it. Linda Thompson wasn't in Elvis's life for his money. She'd stayed with him through the worst years, the deepest addiction spirals, the nights when he couldn't remember his own name. She'd loved him when he was at his lowest, and Elvis knew that. He trusted her in a way he'd stopped trusting almost everyone else, and putting her in that will, giving her legal authority over his estate alongside his daughter, was Elvis's way of saying he knew exactly who the vultures were and he was locking them out. Priscilla's name appeared exactly once in that new will, in a section explicitly reducing her role to symbolic only. No financial control, no management authority, no say in how Graceland operated or how Elvis's image was used or how the money got spent. She'd already received her divorce settlement. She'd already taken what she was legally entitled to. And Elvis made it clear in the language of that document that she would get nothing more. Not because he hated her, but because he'd watched what she did after the divorce. He'd seen how quickly she'd moved on, how little interest she had in his life unless it benefited hers. He knew she didn't love him anymore, if she ever really had, and he wasn't going to let her profit from his death. The will was completed, typed up, reviewed, legally sound. All it needed was Elvis's signature and 2 witnesses to make it official. The attorney scheduled a signing for late August, August 23, 1977, a Tuesday. They'd meet at the same office, finalize everything, and file it with the court that same day. Elvis had 7 days, 1 week to make it to that appointment and lock in the future he wanted. He died on August 16th, 1 week before the signing. And the moment he did, that new will became legally meaningless. Just a draft. Just an idea. Something that could be dismissed as incomplete, never finalized, not representative of Elvis's true wishes. His original will, the one written years earlier when he was still married to Priscilla and had different people in his life, became the governing document. And his longtime attorney, the one with connections to Colonel Parker and financial incentives to maintain the old power structure, assured everyone that the new will was just Elvis being paranoid. Just him going through another phase. Nothing to take seriously. That unsigned will disappeared. Filed away in some archive, locked in some storage facility, forgotten by everyone except the attorney who drafted it. And life moved on. Priscilla positioned herself as the guardian of Elvis's legacy. Vernon tried his best as executor, but was overwhelmed and outmaneuvered at every turn. Lisa Marie grew up surrounded by people managing her father's money while she got an allowance. And the will that Elvis actually wanted, the one that would have changed all of it, gathered dust somewhere in the dark. Because she knew if Elvis signed that document, her access to his legacy ended the moment his heart stopped. Lisa Marie carried that betrayal for the last year of her life. And when she died in January 2023, Riley found her mother's final instructions. Instructions that would ensure Priscilla paid the price for what she'd done. Lisa Marie Presley died on January 12, 2023. Cardiac arrest, just like her father. She was 54 years old, and in the chaos that followed her death, as the world mourned and Priscilla positioned herself once again as the grieving matriarch, Riley Keough found something her mother had left behind. A sealed envelope in Lisa Marie's personal safe, marked with instructions that were impossible to misunderstand. Open only after the estate is secure. Riley waited. She fought through the initial grief, handled the funeral arrangements, dealt with the media circus, and navigated the immediate legal battles that erupted the moment her mother's body was cold. Priscilla challenged the trust documents almost immediately, claiming Lisa Marie had been manipulated, that the paperwork removing Priscilla as co-trustee wasn't valid, that she deserved control over her daughter's estate. It was the same pattern repeating itself across generations. The same grab for power and money disguised as concern and family loyalty. But this time, Priscilla didn't know what was coming. Once the estate was legally secured, once Riley's position as trustee was affirmed by the courts, and Priscilla's challenge was defeated, Riley opened the envelope. Inside was a letter in her mother's handwriting. Not typed. Not dictated to some lawyer. Written by hand, every word deliberate. The kind of letter you write when you know it might be the last thing you ever say to someone you love. And what Lisa Marie said in that letter changed everything Riley thought she understood about her family's history. Lisa Marie didn't hold back. She called her mother's 50-year relationship with Elvis's legacy exactly what it was. A grift. That was the word she used. Not complicated or unfortunate or misunderstood. A grift. Lisa Marie detailed everything she'd discovered in that last year of her life. The deals Priscilla had brokered in the days after Elvis died. The financial arrangements with Colonel Parker that locked Lisa Marie out of her own inheritance until she was 25. The contracts Priscilla had signed on Graceland tourism operations and merchandising without ever consulting the person who actually owned the estate. She wrote about the unsigned will, about her father's handwritten notes, about the evidence that Priscilla had known what Elvis was planning and had actively worked to prevent him from signing that document. She wrote about how Priscilla had positioned herself as the keeper of Elvis's memory while simultaneously selling every piece of him that could generate revenue. The licensing deals that put Elvis's face on slot machines and cheap souvenirs. The decisions made purely for profit with zero regard for dignity or legacy or what Elvis himself would have wanted. But the most devastating part of that letter wasn't the financial betrayal. It was the emotional one. Lisa Marie wrote about being 9 years old and watching her mother treat Graceland like a business opportunity instead of the place where her father had just died. She wrote about growing up surrounded by people who managed her inheritance while she got an allowance from her own money. She wrote about asking Priscilla questions as a teenager about why certain decisions were made and being told she was too young to understand, too emotional, too much like her father. And then Lisa Marie wrote the instruction that Riley is still executing today. Do not let her be buried next to my father. She doesn't deserve to spend eternity next to a man she spent 50 years exploiting. Those were her mother's exact words. Not a suggestion. Not something to consider. A direct command from a daughter who'd spent her entire life watching her mother profit from her father's death and had finally found the proof of how deep the betrayal went. Riley didn't hesitate. She assembled a legal team and started researching the meditation garden's burial rites. What she found was a clause in the property deed that most people didn't know existed. Graceland Cemetery operates under specific restrictions that allow direct descendants to veto burial requests for non-blood family members if there's documented evidence of financial malfeasance or actions contrary to the estate's interests. It was an obscure provision, probably added decades ago to prevent exactly this kind of situation. And Lisa Marie's documentation, everything she'd compiled in that last year, met the legal threshold perfectly. Riley's attorneys filed the amendment in February 2024. 73 pages of legal documentation that included financial records, contracts, correspondence between Priscilla and various business entities, and excerpts from Elvis's handwritten notes that Lisa Marie had found in that storage unit. The evidence was overwhelming. Priscilla's legal team tried to fight it initially, threatening to take the case to trial, to make it public, to turn it into a media spectacle that would force Riley to back down. But then something interesting happened. Priscilla went silent. No more legal filings, no more public statements, just silence. Because she knew if this went to trial, if everything Lisa Marie had found became part of the public record, the carefully constructed image she'd spent 5 decades building would collapse. The world would see the contract signed before Elvis was buried, the deals with Colonel Parker, the manipulation of a 9-year-old girl's inheritance, the evidence that she'd known about Elvis's plans to remove her from his will and had worked to prevent it. Riley released one statement through her attorneys, short, direct, and final. My mother's last wish was to protect my grandfather's dignity. I'm honoring that. Nothing more needed to be said. The clause was enforceable. The documentation was solid. And Priscilla Presley's name would never appear on a burial plot in the meditation garden. When Priscilla dies, she'll be buried somewhere else. Alone, away from Elvis, away from Lisa Marie, away from Benjamin and the family she spent 50 years claiming as her own. And that's not cruelty. That's not a granddaughter being vindictive or petty or unnecessarily harsh. That's justice for a man who couldn't protect himself from the people who turned his death into a business. That's a daughter's final act of love for a father who tried to escape and ran out of time. That's Riley keeping a promise to her mother, honoring the truth that 3 generations of Presley women carried and finally had the courage to speak. If you think the Presley family drama ends here, you're wrong. The battle over Elvis's name, his image, and his money is far from over. And there are still secrets about Lisa Marie's final days that haven't been told. Click the next video to see what really happened in the hours before she died.